No matter what anyone is interested in, there's always differing degrees of interest. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a simple example. Somebody who supports a football team. What does it mean, supports a football team? Actually, there's all different levels of involvement that it could represent. Think about it. There'll be those people who, if their team happens to win the league one year, they're going to feel quite glad about it. But apart from hearing that, they probably don't take any interest at any other time. Whereas there'll be other people who maybe support a team, and if they see it's on the television that team is playing, then they'll watch it. And maybe each week they'll look at the scores just to see how that team is doing, and that's the extent of their commitment. And yet, of course, there'll be other people who go to every match, be it home or away. Even if they're playing overseas, they'll save up and they'll make sure that they're there for that game. They'll buy all the kit to wear. They will be totally occupied by it. And following that team will have taken over the whole of their life. Let's take another example. Supposing people, as many are concerned about environmental issues. Again, there's different degrees of involvement in that, different degrees of commitment. There will be some people who will put the television on and it's the news, and they'll watch the news, and there'll be an item about the environment, and they'll be thinking to themselves, but that's not good. Something should be done. But that's the extent of their commitment. Other people will take a step further and think, well, actually I'm going to do my bit. And what they will do is when they go shopping, they'll look at the products and they'll think about the ethical and environmental impact of what they're going to buy, and they'll try to adjust their behaviour accordingly. And then, of course, there are other people who will be totally committed. They'll join campaigning groups, they'll write to their MP, they'll go on protests, they'll follow what campaignings are happening elsewhere in the world, they'll engage in that, and if at all possible, they'll even go and join in. See the spectrum of commitment, no matter what the interest. And the same is absolutely true with the Christian faith. What we have in our passage here is a small glimpse of the Apostle Paul's commitment to the Christian faith. Now, we've been doing this very short series on Thessalonians. Let's just remind ourselves about the context. Paul had planted this church in Thessalonica. He spent some time there, he built the church up, and then unexpectedly he had to leave in a hurry because persecution affecting him. He had to abandon the place, rush out, and couldn't go back. How concerned was he about the people who he knew who had come to faith, and about the whole work of the gospel to which he'd been committed, which had taken him there in the first place? Well, the story so far in this book is he was sufficiently concerned to have sent Timothy, one of his fellow workers, into Thessalonica to find out what's going on. And what this our short passage today is about is Timothy brought back a good report. A good report that actually the believers in Thessalonica, who were facing difficult times, were actually sticking to the faith, doing well, carrying on. And what we've got is the insight to the effect of that news on Paul and his response. Look at it for a moment. The first thing we see when Timothy comes back with this report is it brings Paul joy. He's encouraged by it. Well, why is he encouraged by it? Because he's committed to the gospel. They're committed to the gospel. He's facing hard times, so he's struggling himself. They are facing hard times, but the fact that they are keeping going is an encouragement to him. So the first effect is it brings him joy. He's gladdened by the news of what he's hearing. And then we're told that this news has caused him to pray, and it says it's caused him to pray night and day. Now actually, that's a very interesting comment to have in there. It's caused him to pray night and day. Because in chapter 2, he'd already written that when he was with them in Thessalonica, he laboured night and day. So we've got, in 2 consecutive chapters, Paul, he laboured night and day, and he prayed night and day. When he said he laboured night and day, he did. At this point in his ministry, he didn't have external financial support, so he worked as a tent maker, making tents, and in his spare time, he went out and did the job of ministry, witnessing and sharing the gospel and teaching people. So he was extremely busy. Now, how could he be labouring night and day and praying night and day? Well, the only answer to that is he must have been doing the two together. By definition, it's not all night and all day, then he's working night and day and he's praying night and day. He must have been doing the two together. This really tells us something about prayer, or how Paul used to pray, from which we can learn something maybe about what prayer should be. For the Apostle Paul, praying was not just something that you do for a couple of minutes when you get up in the morning, and then maybe another couple of minutes when you go to bed at night. Or something that maybe we just do collectively when we come together as a church. No, for him, prayer was clearly something very different to that. He prayed night and day. So when he was working, whether that was making his tents or going out sharing the gospel, he was praying. When he came home and maybe he was tired, what did he do? He prayed. When he woke up in the night, what would he do? He would pray. His commitment to the Christian gospel, his commitment to the faith, his relationship with Christ permeated the whole of his life. And then this passage tells us what he prayed. He prays that he might visit them, and it says, and supply them with what they lacked. What he wanted to do was to make these believers who were doing well, of whom there had been a good report from Thessalonica, he wanted to make them even more into the people that they could be. So on hearing the news of how they're doing, he wants to go and join in. Go and join in. Go and not just be there, but actually help out. Take what he could offer and add it to what they were already doing. That was his level of commitment. The Apostle Paul, what we see in this passage, is when he hears about another church doing them carrying on somewhere else, he's encouraged just by that news. And also, that commitment he has to the faith permeates the whole of his life, to the extent that he wants to go and actually get involved and add something more to it. And then in the final section of this short passage, verses 11 to 13, Paul then writes a prayer. He writes a prayer. And he prays that God would clear the way for him to go to them. That clear the way, it simply means remove the obstacles, make level the path for him to go to them. There's something in that recognises that we live in a fallen world. We live in a world where there's a lot of evil, a lot of hardship, a lot of suffering. There's a lot that comes in that can hinder, that can make things hard for us to do what we want to do for the gospel. So his prayer is that God would intervene, that he would put to rest the works of the evil one, that he would make it possible for him to go. And then he prays for the people who were there, that their love would be increased, that their love would be increased everybody else. Basically, he wants that the believers who are working in that work to value one another more and treat one another with true love and true compassion. And also to show that to everybody outside the church. What he's really praying there is that they will become more Christ-like. As we think about it, well, that's what Christ did. It's what we saw in Christ. Endless love, endless compassion, building his church, reaching out to the world. That's Paul's prayer for them. And then finally, in his written prayer, he writes that God would strengthen their hearts so that they won't fall away. So that in all the hardship, these believers won't get distracted, won't give up, and our passage ends with reference to Christ's coming. You know, that's always the key motivator of the New Testament church. That when Christ returns, he would find us and the Thessalonians, his people, made into what God would really want them to be, so that the New Testament describes us as being presented perfect before him when he comes. That was Paul's prayer. As I started with, no matter what somebody's interest is, there are degrees of commitment, whether that's following a football team, showing interest in environmental issues, or our commitment to the Christian faith. So the question for each one of us is really, what about us? How committed are we? When we hear what's going on elsewhere, what God is doing in churches, in other places, does it encourage us? Does it gladden us? Or are we just focused on what we're doing here? How much does the gospel permeate our daily life? And how determined are